You know what's strange? We live in a time where every generation is loudly defined. Boomers are blamed, millennials are analyzed, Gen Z is decoded in real time. But there's a group in the middle that rarely explains itself and almost never asks to be understood. Generation X. They were born into analog childhoods and digital adulthoods. They grew up before the internet, but built careers inside it. They remember life before constant connection, and they adapted without announcing it. And here's the question that really matters. What happens to a generation that learned independence before it learned emotional vocabulary? Let's go back. It's 1978. A kid walks home from school alone. The air smells like cut grass. No phone in their pocket. No parent tracking their location. They unlock the door and step into silence. That silence wasn't neglect in most cases. It was normal. Parents were working. Divorce rates were climbing. The economy was shifting. Supervision wasn't constant, and childhood had more empty space. But empty space changes people. When you grow up in a quiet house after school, you learn to manage time. You learn to cook something simple. You learn to entertain yourself. You learn to calm your own fears when the house makes a strange noise. Independence becomes muscle memory. Psychologists describe this as developing a strong internal locus of control, the belief that your life outcomes are tied to your own actions. Generation X didn't read about that concept. They practiced it daily. If homework wasn't done, you paid for it. If you broke something, you fixed it or faced consequences. If you were bored, you figured it out. And boredom is important here. Today, boredom is often eliminated instantly. But boredom in the 70s and 80s forced creativity. It forced imagination. It forced problem solving. You didn't scroll. You built something. You explored outside. You invented games. You negotiated rules with neighborhood kids without adult referees. That builds social resilience. But it also builds emotional containment. Because when you're alone often, you learn to process feelings internally. There isn't always someone available to co-regulate with you, so you regulate yourself. That skill becomes strength in adulthood, but it can also become distance. Now, layer in the broader cultural atmosphere. The Cold War created a low-level background anxiety, nuclear drills in classrooms, news anchors speaking about global tension like weather forecasts, political scandals exposing corruption, economic recessions hitting families hard. The message wasn't always spoken, but it was absorbed. Stability is fragile. And when children internalize fragility, they adapt strategically. Instead of assuming things will work out, they start asking, what if they don't? This is where defensive pessimism emerges, expecting difficulty not to be negative, but to be prepared. You don't assume the company will protect you. You assume you need skills. You don't assume the relationship will last forever. You value loyalty, but you keep emotional backups. You don't assume authority is wise. You evaluate competence. Generation X became pragmatic observers. Let's talk about work. They entered adulthood during corporate restructuring, outsourcing, and economic turbulence. Many watched their parents dedicate decades to a single employer, only to be laid off. That image sticks. So Gen X didn't build identity around the company. They built it around capability. Being indispensable became a survival strategy. Learn the system, understand the mechanics, know how to fix what others can't. That way, if layoffs come, you have leverage. And here's something subtle but powerful. They don't always advertise their competence. They just demonstrate it. This quiet competence can be misinterpreted as detachment, but often it's confidence built through repetition. They've solved problems before. They'll solve them again. However, that same self-reliance has a shadow. Studies show Gen X adults are less likely to seek social support during stress, not because they lack relationships, but because asking feels uncomfortable. When you've handled things alone since childhood, vulnerability feels unfamiliar. You can manage chaos, but saying, "I need help," can feel like failure. That doesn't mean they don't feel deeply. It means they learn to contain deeply. Let's look at privacy. Gen X made mistakes before permanent digital records existed. Embarrassing moments faded naturally. Stories lived locally. So when social media exploded, constant self-disclosure didn't feel liberating to many of them. It felt risky. Oversharing can trigger a subconscious alarm. Exposure equals vulnerability. This is why many Gen Xers consume technology efficiently, but share selectively. They understand the tool. They just don't need it to validate identity. Now, let's explore humor. If you spend time around Gen X, you'll notice irony, dry wit, sarcasm delivered casually. Irony works as psychological cushioning. If you joke about something painful, it stings less. If you present everything with a slight smirk, no one can fully see where you're soft. Humor becomes both bridge and barrier. And this developed in an era where emotional conversations weren't as normalized as they are now. Therapy wasn't mainstream. Feelings weren't always discussed at the dinner table. So Gen X developed emotional fluency internally, not always verbally. Here's a real-life story that illustrates this. A man born in 1969 described surviving multiple industry downturns. He said, "I never assumed a job was permanent. I always had a plan B." When asked how he coped with the stress, he shrugged and said, "You just deal with it." But later, he admitted he struggled with sleep during layoffs. He just didn't talk about it. That pattern is common: resilience paired with silence. Another example. A woman born in 1975 remembered walking to school alone from age 6. She described feeling proud of her independence, but when her own child turned 6, she hesitated to grant the same freedom. Why? Because once you've felt that level of self-reliance, you understand both its strength and its weight. Generation X parenting often swings toward giving children more supervision and emotional affirmation than they themselves received, not because they resent their upbringing, but because they want to soften its harder edges. And here's something fascinating from cognitive science. Before the internet, accessing information required effort. You searched physical catalogs, you skimmed indexes, you waited. Effort deepens in coding. When something takes time to find, it embeds more strongly in memory. This may explain why Gen X often prefers understanding systems deeply rather than skimming surface information. They grew up troubleshooting hardware, not just apps. They flipped bikes upside down to fix chains. They adjusted TV antennas. They recorded songs off the radio at the perfect moment. Those experiences build mechanical intuition and patience. Now, zoom out. Generation X stands between two dramatically different worlds: pre-digital scarcity and digital abundance. They remember when information was limited, and they adapted to when it became infinite. They remember when privacy was default, and they navigated when visibility became currency. They remember when boredom was normal, and now they manage constant stimulation. That bridging role shapes their worldview. They tend to value stability, but expect disruption. They value loyalty, but prioritize skill. They value independence, but quietly crave reliability in others. And here's the nuance. Generational traits are patterns, not boxes. Not every Gen Xer was a latchkey kid. Not everyone distrusts authority. Not everyone avoids social media. But the collective environment shaped common adaptations: early autonomy, repeated instability, limited emotional supervision. The result? A generation that learned to stand alone and stand steady. The upside is obvious: adaptability, competence, emotional endurance. The downside is subtler: difficulty relaxing control, discomfort with dependency, a persistent readiness for disruption.
So, what can we learn from this? First, resilience is often born from necessity, not preference. Second, strength without vulnerability can become isolation. Third, every generation develops survival strategies based on their environment. Gen X survived uncertainty by building inner scaffolding. Millennials survived instability by building community networks. Gen Z survives digital overload by curating identity and boundaries. None are superior. They are adaptive responses to different pressures. If you were Gen X, maybe the next evolution isn't becoming stronger. You already are. Maybe it's allowing yourself to lean occasionally, to trust support without equating it with weakness.
If you are not Gen X, maybe the takeaway is empathy. That calm colleague who doesn't complain, they may have been self-managing since childhood. That parent who seems emotionally steady, they may have learned to steady themselves long before adulthood. Bridges rarely demand recognition. They hold weight quietly. Generation X became a bridge between eras, analog to digital, institutional trust to skepticism, supervised childhoods to autonomous ones. And bridges matter most when things are crossing. Maybe the real story isn't that Gen X is invisible. Maybe it's that they never needed to be seen to feel real. And maybe, just maybe, understanding that quiet strength helps all of us appreciate the resilience that often goes unannounced.